Just before we get started, I will...
Apologies. I sometimes forget that as soon as I hit record and expand it into full screen, it automatically will do that. You're going to Green River Zesty Lime Soda. You're about to go with me on this little voyage. A little bit of lime, more sugar. I felt like living a little dangerous, so I've got some Tennessee whiskey here, some strawberry lemonade whiskey. It's pretty good. And I got my peach iced tea. Could use some food, but I don't have any right now. All right. Before we get started, which I've already started, click the little thumbs up. If you could do that for me, that helps out tremendously. This is Side Projects, Creepy Archaeological Discoveries. Archaeological Discoveries, yes. Okay. You can subscribe to the channel. I'm asking you if you could, even though most people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, which makes no sense. So, if you want, that's great. You can donate to the channel through the thanks button, and if you do, you can have me react to a video, and I'll do that, and then your name will be sponsoring that video. You can still request, it just takes a little longer if you're not donating, because I have more of a list. But I lost my list, so you probably have a better chance now. So let's get to the video.
Say that this video is brought to you by Beard Blaze. Some of you might have heard this before, but I've got another channel called Brain Blaze, and that actually led to the development of this very product right here, and a bunch of other products as well. Long story short, I made a joke on one of those videos on that other channel about how many YouTubers have beauty products, and a fan of that channel emailed me saying that he could make that happen, but for beard oil rather than beauty products. I mean, although technically, I guess. And we made it happen. We've got a range of beard oils that are all available at beardblaze.com, and it makes a full, luscious beard a reality, solving all of life's problems with fine facial hair. Absolutely not a guarantee. So the fan who emailed me, Will, he sent me a bunch of samples. I rubbed them into my beard like some sort of lab rat, picked out a bunch that I liked, and then we bottled them up and just absolutely made them available at beardblaze.com. And what I like particularly is whenever
I'm going to start my own line. It's called Kris Stanton's Gasoline for Your Beard. And it's basically just gasoline. So let me know if you want some. I'll send it to you.
I've had beard oil before, which is oil you put in your beard. It helps keep all the little untidy pieces in and the beard healthy and all of that stuff. It always came in tiny bottles and it was super expensive. So we made it in a large bottle and we made it for a great price. There is a link to Beard Blaze below, and let's get into today's video. Creepy archaeological discoveries. What could be more self-explanatory and also brilliant clickbait for YouTube?
It has a slight soap taste to it. With a hint of lemon. Maybe that's what it is. There's a slight soapy taste to it. I have another one called Lemon Meringue Pie Soda.
Let's just jump into the entries, shall we? In early 2020, the remains of 4 ancient female warriors unearthed in Western Russia caused quite a stir in archaeological circles. Buried together, the deceased ranged in age from about 12 to 50 at the time of their deaths, around 2,500 years ago. Similar graves had been discovered previously, but few contained occupants of such varying ages, and more interestingly, the youngest girl's tendons had been severed after her death to allow her to be positioned as if she were riding a horse, which she must have done during her short life, or that would be a really weird thing to do to her dead body. Also, kind of a weird thing to do to a dead body anyway, to be honest. All had been laid to rest on traditional wooden bed-like platforms that had been covered with grass mats, and other telling artifacts were found as well. They included bracelets made from glass beads, multiple iron weapons like knives and spearheads, and a polished bronze mirror, all of which identified them as belonging to the Scythian nomadic culture that flourished on the vast steppes between Eastern Europe and Asia between 2,700 and 1,600 years ago. But unlike the legends of female warriors of truly Amazonian proportions, these Russian women were not 10 feet tall. That was definitely a legend. In fact, they were about the same size as most women today, but they all died at the same time from wounds sustained during battle. Archaeologists determined that they were probably buried in November or December based on the remains of a lamb that were found with them. Archaeology is amazing. Bone analysis revealed that the animal was between 6 and 8 months old, and since spring lambs are generally born in March or April, they were able to approximate when the women were buried. Clever stuff. The ends of the lamb's bones were greenish and showed signs of polishing, which meant that they'd been cooked in a bronze pot, probably to sustain the deceased on their journey through the afterlife. In addition, the oldest woman was adorned with an ornately engraved ceremonial headdress, which at about 70% pure gold was much higher quality than most gold of that era. In other words, she was certainly a person of high standing. Though young women were considered adults much earlier back then than they are now, the 12-year-old girl was probably a warrior in training, though she died alongside sisters, aunts, and possibly even a mother. But despite the site's uniqueness, more than a dozen similar graves of women warriors have been exhumed in west-central Russian villages near the Ukrainian border in recent years. The find lends credence to the theory that bands of warrior women did roam much of the region, but determining the sex of historic remains isn't easy. This is largely due to decomposition, the fact that male humans don't have telltale penis bones like other animals, and persistent contemporary social biases that together have led historians and archaeologists to assume that nearly all warriors of yesteryear were men and boys. Now, it's evident that this isn't the case, and previously unavailable DNA analysis is bearing it out. Prior to recent finds, it was often assumed that tales of women warriors were little more than fanciful stories, despite the fact that they were mentioned and depicted much further back in historic texts and works of art. But as the idea of women warriors becomes more accepted, whispers of purported lesbianism and misandry soon followed. There's little evidence to support these claims, but though they weren't giants, many warrior women may have been nearly as physically able as the men. In 2017, the remains of 20-something Armenian women showed musculature and skeletal development similar to a man's. She also had an arrowhead lodged in her leg and was adorned with jewelry and multiple scars indicative of numerous battles. What's not clear, however, is whether these women fought alongside men or independent of them, or whether the societies in which they lived were matriarchal or patriarchal. It has been theorized that they may have been left behind to defend land and homes while the men were off waging war in far-off lands. Sadly, archaeologists...
I was just about to say they must have been, the men must have been gone for whatever reason, and they were left, and they were trained, and they were left just kind of like protecting the homestead at the time. And because the men were gone, other warriors, men, figured they would have a chance to be able to come in and, kill them and burn their crops or take their crop, typical war things. So I would wonder if that's how they died. Not saying they couldn't defend themselves, but if you just look at the basics of men versus women, that was the alcohol. Sorry. In battle, men versus women, just physically, it's going to lean more towards the men.
Concede that the grave was ransacked and looted long before they discovered it, and that the missing items would have shed more light on the lives and the deaths of the women. That said, it's evidence that they were buried in much the same way as men of high social and military status would have been, so even if they weren't members of a tribe of all-women warriors, they probably enjoyed nearly equal status with their male counterparts. While on a relatively mundane dig in Dorset along England's south-central coast, archaeologists made one of the most unique discoveries of recent memory. They immediately began recording the positions of mounds of still partially covered bones, and what they eventually found was a mass grave containing the headless remains of more than 4 dozen Viking warriors. Uncovered in the summer of 2009, radiocarbon dating determined the remains to be about 1,000.
Did he just say the headless remains? But all we saw there was heads. Did I mishear him? Sorry.
They eventually found was a mass grave containing the headless remains of more than 4 dozen Viking warriors. Uncovered in the summer of 2009, radiocarbon dating determined the remains to be about 1,000 years old, which showed that the Vikings probably lived between 910 and 1030 AD, a period when many coastal Brits regularly clashed with marauding seafarers from the north. But though the Vikings' heads had been decapitated, they were stacked neatly in a pile separate from the other bones. As successive layers of earth were stripped away, it became apparent that they had been manipulated prior to burial and that they were grouped together by type. In other words, pelvises were in one pile, femurs were in another, rib cages were in another pile, and so on and grimly so forth. The question that remained was, well, why would anyone do this? It was theorized that the Vikings had attacked a local village, but had been overpowered and killed by the indignant citizens. Then, after killing the invaders, they stripped the deceased's bodies of clothes and other useful items like weapons, tools, and shoes before dismembering them. Perhaps just the unmitigated bloodlust of a population who'd been on the receiving end of horrific violence once too often, the heads may initially have been carried off as macabre trophies, mantelpiece curiosities, or perhaps placed on pikes around the village to ward off those who might show up later to exact revenge. If so, the heads were eventually returned to the burial site probably about the same time that they began to rot and stink. That would make a lot of sense. But archaeologists also found that the cuts and strike marks on the Vikings were all delivered from the front and that they were already dead, which disproved the notion that they'd been ripped apart by a violent mob or killed in battle. On the contrary, the precise nature of the wound seemed to show that they'd been ritually slaughtered, as in sacrificed, albeit in a manner not previously seen in the region. Whatever their motivation for such wanton butchery, it's one of the few incidents in recorded history in which Vikings were the one who ended up without their heads, because this ghoulish distinction was, well, usually reserved for their victims. If the fearsome and battle-hardened marauders were defeated by villagers who presumably had boring jobs as cobblers, carpenters, and fishermen, it's likely that they knew their adversaries were coming, had far superior numbers, and were organized by someone with formal military training. In the summer of 2018, archaeologists discovered an immense black sarcophagus in Alexandria, Egypt, that had remained untouched just 15 feet, that's 4.5 meters, beneath the ground for approximately 2 millennia. Unwittingly unearthed at a construction site, the largely intact burial box tipped the scales at a whopping 60,000 pounds, that's over 27,000 kilograms, making it among the largest ever discovered. Believed to date from the early Ptolemaic dynasty, which began around 325 BC, unlike others from the era, the black sarcophagus was built from dark granite and encased in a thick layer of mortar that was in surprisingly good condition. While antiquities authorities decided what to do with the find, some historians surmise that the relic may contain the remains of one of history's most influential figures, Alexander the Great. Though there wasn't really any evidence for this, the object's unique color and immense size led them to believe that at the very least, a person or people of some importance resided inside. On the other hand, some worried that the vault's blackness was an overt warning and that opening it was a really bad idea. After all, it's commonly believed that diseases, germs, microbes, and even ancient hexes lay dormant indefinitely. And some of those things I'm worried about. And some, like hexes, I just wouldn't be. Archaeologists would be like, oh no, not another hex.
What have we done?
The legend of the mummy's curse began in the early 1920s when famous English Egyptologist Lord Carnarvon died shortly after opening Tutankhamun's burial chamber. The culprit was almost certainly a mosquito bite inflicted around the same time, but since the rumors have continued to circulate and it's possible that mold, bacteria, and deadly pathogens can survive for extended periods in states of dormancy, people are still concerned. Nonetheless, Egypt's Antiquities Ministry gave a select group of archaeologists permission to open the sarcophagus. Due to the lid's weight, they had trouble raising it, and when it had been lifted just a few inches, they were hit by a hex. Not really, they were hit by an odor so pungent that they hastily lowered it back into place. Later, they donned face masks, gloves, and hazmat suits and called in the heavy equipment. Inside, they found 3 skeletons, partially submerged in a reddish-brown sludge composed of putrefied blood, liquefied organs, excrement, and urine that had been stewing for a very long time. Thankfully, the tomb didn't contain any deadly viruses or curses, and it became evident almost immediately that those who'd been laid to rest inside didn't have a high social standing as expected. In fact, the mummified remains hadn't been cared for particularly well, and in the end, the deceased were probably little more than servants servants or run-of-the-mill foot soldiers assigned to the royal family. The skull of one had been cracked by a spear or an arrow, and to add to the mystery, a decayed and unidentified alabaster bust lay among the waterlogged bones as well. If they were soldiers, the bust could have been from their commander or perhaps the pharaoh who'd reigned at the time of their death, both of which would have shed more light on exactly who they were and how they'd ended up together in an ominous black granite box. When Mount Vesuvius erupted near Pompeii in 79 AD, the force of the explosion was so great that hundreds of thousands of multi-ton rocks were sent hurtling through the sky. Many smashed through homes and buildings miles away, but at least one fell in an even more unlikely place, on top of an already terrified man who may have been running for his life. Or at least, that's how archaeologists originally thought the scenario played out. Since the man was found face down near Pompeii Archaeological Park with a huge rock covering the upper portion of his body, junior diggers, local volunteers, and even a few well-regarded archaeologists concluded that it was an open and shut case. However, subsequent investigators turned up a few interesting clues that had been overlooked. First, before his untimely death, the man had suffered from a leg infection that was so advanced that it may have eventually been fatal if he hadn't been killed in the eruption. The infection would have made him particularly slow, and where others may have been fast enough to get indoors immediately after the eruption, he wasn't. Because so few people were killed by flying rocks, he's often referred to as the world's unluckiest man, but some scientists now admit that they may have gotten it all wrong, largely because when the rock was removed, they found the man's skull, limbs, spine, and torso were largely intact and uncrushed. His death was therefore almost certainly caused by something else, probably asphyxia resulting from pyroclastic flow, which is how the vast majority of victims perish during volcanic events. Pyroclastic flows are dense, rolling masses of ash, superheated gases, and pulverized lava fragments that are spewed outwards during volcanic eruptions. In the case of Vesuvius, the volume of the pyroclastic flow probably measured in the tens or hundreds of thousands of tons. Amazingly hot and moving at breakneck speed, it killed and obliterated much of what was in its path, including the poor Pompeian guy with a bum leg. The man's final resting place along a narrow alley surrounded by multiple-story villas made it unlikely that the rock had rained down on him from above as previously thought. Archaeologists now believe that he was attempting to get away from the pyroclastic flow and possibly looking over his shoulder while hobbling away when he was hit with a hot wall of vapors and ash that knocked him down and either killed him immediately or rendered him unconscious. Then, either already dead or incapacitated, the rock was carried along by the encroaching lava and ultimately came to rest on top of him when the flow subsided. So the man was definitely unlucky, but probably not any more unlucky than any of the other 16,000 folks who were killed in this epic historical event. While excavating northern Italy's Longbourn necropolis in the mid-80s, archaeologists discovered the remains of a man with a unique prosthetic appendage that lived between 1,200 and 1,400 years ago. Hundreds of skeletons were unearthed in the necropolis, and sort of like in The Godfather, there was a horse, although it was missing its head. Despite these unique finds, however, the one-armed man stood out. Though his normal left arm was extended by his side, what was left of the right one was bent at the elbow and laid across his abdomen. Just a few inches away, aligned with his amputated wrist, was a large knife blade, as well as a corroded metal buckle and 2 strips of decomposed organic matter that were later determined to be leather. Many of the men at Longbourn had been buried with knives and tools, but Knife Arm's implement of choice was rather different. Subsequent investigation suggested that his prosthetic arm wasn't capped with a clumsy makeshift hand, but a removable knife blade that was attached by a belt-like strap. Bone analysis revealed that the man was between 40 and 50, or well past his prime for the standards of the day. His arm had been amputated around the mid-forearm years previously, probably after a traumatic injury like a compound fracture from a fall or being crushed by a large stone. Even back then, medical amputations were relatively common, but most people who lost limbs didn't live very long afterward. So why did he have a knife for an arm? Because after all, having a lethal blade instead of a hand would be intimidating to others and downright dangerous when instinctively scratching an annoying itch near one's eye or groin. Though there was some disagreement as to whether the knife was a prosthesis at all, most archaeologists now agree that the bulbous calcium deposits on the ends of the severed bones are particularly telling. These buildups are common on amputated bones, and furthermore, the man's teeth provided more evidence to the prosthetic theory. The molars on the side of the missing limb were deformed and nearly stripped of their enamel, which meant that instead of using his good arm and hand to tighten the strap, he used his teeth and jaws. Archaeology is so cool. It's amazing they can figure this out. Over the years, after multiple daily fastenings and refastenings, his teeth deformed so much so that they caused an infection in his jawbone, which, ironically, might have been what killed him. The man's shoulder also showed evidence of stress consistent with muscular and skeletal compensation due to a missing limb, but it's not clear whether the knife was used as a fighting or defensive implement, or if the man worked in some trade where it came in handy, like him being a butcher. Whatever the case, long before the age of antibiotics, he made a remarkable recovery and lived a relatively long life. Though the manner of his burial suggests that he was a person of low status, his survival points to significant value placed on human life, even for the poor and damaged. Since it's likely that the man wouldn't have been able to afford the operation or prosthesis on his own, he may have had some kind of financial help or paid by bartering instead of using cash. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Archaeology.
Knife arm. That one was interesting. Ugh. Open up that black sarcophagus and just, ugh, smelling all that poops. Oh, that wasn't pleasant. Well, hope you enjoyed that. I did. It was very interesting. What did I say? It was very interesting. And oh my gosh, it's the alcohol. And entertaining. I put a little bit of iced tea in it. Now it's making me tired. Okay. So we're going to end this here. Hope you enjoyed. If you have another video to recommend for me, let me know. But until next time, have a good day, have a good night.